Thank you, Tista, and thank you, Adil, for inviting me. I have a lot of happy memories in CSH, so it's always lovely to be back here. Uh, Actually, when I look around this room, I see like a lot of people who have very important, influence on my work. So, of course, Ashwini doesn't want to mention it, but she was my tutor. She was a very young professor then. Uh, Professor Tilak here, he's my Drona, I'm Ekalavya. If you know the story, he has written many papers. He doesn't know about me so much. But I remember when I was doing my PhD, I wrote a paper with Chandrasekhar at IGIDR on the cost of education and the impact. And I sent it to him. And of course, there was no reply. But I met him in a conference in 2005. And he said, yeah, I've seen the paper. And that meant so much to us that, he had actually looked at the paper and at least he said he had read it. So, no, also I want to point out that, the field of education in India has been basically, shouldn't say taken over, but it's largely dominated by educationists who look at issues of pedagogy and there are very few people who have actually looked at the connection between education and economic outcomes. And I think Professor Tilak has been one of those people who have been, working on that. So for an economist, that's a very big, someone to look up to and stuff. And of course, Beena and I, we talk a lot nowadays, so I kind of sound her out on various ideas. Yeah. And Nicola here. So in CSH, I've learned a lot. I know I'm taking some moments of Magra. It's a nice occasion to also thank. So Nicola and Himanshu, he's not around. So Nicola was the one who taught me that theory is not separate from empirical work. And so we actually did distribution analysis using things, so that I learned a lot. And Himanshu, who I, one of when you come out of a US graduate school, tools is the only thing you worry about. And I think Himanshu has been kind of the sanity voice in telling me that, look at your results also. Tools are only one part of the story. So, I mean, if he were here, I would thank him. So, this is a part of a lot of work I have done in this particular area. It's work with Amparo, who's been my collaborator on many of these projects. And Ravinder, actually, this paper is Ravinder's paper. We've just put our name and I keep presenting it here and there because I'm not doing much work. So it's on rural prosperity through tertiary education. So again, I think I have the same problem. Is it? Okay. So, from an economist point of view, macro literature. So let me say that if you run a Minserian regression, which is a regression of, education levels on economic kind of outcomes like income and so on and so forth, there is, a strong correlation, whether it's causal or not. I think people have done it in causal frameworks also. But whenever you move to a macro level, the results are always at odds with the micro level, which means that it seems individuals have there is an impact of education on individual earnings. But when you move up towards like, either regional growth or GDPs and so on and so forth, actually that link is fairly weak. And Pritchett was the person who pointed this out in 2004. The paper was titled "Where Has All the Education Gone?" And he looked at, enrollment levels, test scores, so and so forth, and really found very little. So there's 10 to 15%, impacts at the micro level. But at macro level, it depends. Sometimes it's there, sometimes not there, depends on what you control for, and so on and so forth, which has led to this idea that, all this micro return is just privilege, nothing else. We're making some problem. It's just, people are connected, people can get these high paying jobs. So the income actually reflects privilege and nothing about productivity, which is what economists care about. Um, so, so there is a large literature starting in the 2000s trying to think about this problem. And so the early literature on this essentially got this, macro impact from looking across countries. But of course, they're confounded by what are called institutions, which is basically a, one word for many things, right? Whether it be law and order, it be attitude, it be, functional society, all these things are very hard to measure. Okay. And so the answer to that in that literature is that we need to make tighter comparisons. So let's not compare the US to India. Let's compare within India, within US, within China, and so on and so forth. And there is a literature that has emerged on regional development. So in the case of India, I have contributed to some of this literature. The first one was at the JDE, which looked at state level. And the second one was at the Economic Journal, which looked at district level data. And the verdict from these papers is that, yes, human capital as measured by education, or that aspect of human capital, does affect state as well as district prosperity measured by various indices, some collected by surveys, some collected from space, so on and so forth. But the main role is the role of tertiary education completion. I should have put the word completion. Okay. And so it doesn't mean that lower levels of education don't matter. Of course, you don't reach from illiteracy to higher education without going through the whole, primary middle. It is that the only meaningful level of education that matters to the economy is the share of people who have actually completed tertiary education. Okay. And not surprisingly, the intermediary, the channel, is through service sector. And that's basically what's explained the role of human capital in the case of India. Now, this kind of idea is consistent with these ideas, these models of structural transformation, which think about it like this. Think about higher educated people. So education rises, there are people who get higher educated, they move from the primary sector to the secondary sector. So typically people at various levels of education, from primary, they're in agriculture, then they go to secondary, then they go to manufacturing, and then they go to tertiary, university education, and they go to service sector. This is a caricature kind of model. India doesn't always fit very nicely in that, but roughly. Typically, all these models take place, this kind of thought, right from Arthur Lewis, takes place with movement of labor, and typically from rural to urban. So these are all the classical models of, of migration, Harris Todaro, and so on and so forth, but also more recently. So this process obviously would lead to a positive link between rise in human capital, rising share of service sector, rising urbanization, because urbanization is basically this process, and that leads to growth and development. And this is the idea that has been talked about by various people. So there is this idea in our head that higher education leads to service sector, which is in urban areas, and that leads to growth. Okay, so this kind of model, kind of and various kinds of narrative fit that kind of idea. However, according to the census of 2011, approximately 1/3 of the tertiary educated, which is university, graduate and above, actually reside in rural areas. And in fact, if you want, and as now that thunder has been taken away by Professor Tilak, the share of tertiary education within rural areas is growing very fast. So the first graph is basically one of 25 and above. That's typically the labor force when people have stopped accumulating human capital. So that has gone up in 91 from 1.68 to about 6%. These are all in rural India. Actually, if you look among the young, that proportion has gone up from about 2.6% to 12%. So this is the kind of I would say, a silent revolution that's been happening all throughout. And, it's also, you can see that in some of the stats that Professor Tilak put out in terms of inequalities. So the question then is, if 1/3 of them live there, and this is a fast growing population that's staying, then does this lead to rural prosperity? And asking that question, you live there. No, live there, right? These are households, these are living there. That's important. And well, we don't know about that, but they're living there. 25 and above, they live there. Okay. Their education may not be, though that is also increasing quite a lot. This kind of idea, so what this particular paper is asking is that these people live there, right? Does this lead to rural prosperity? And if so, should we be focusing a little bit away from this idea of urbanization as we kind of think? In fact, many commentators in this literature don't even use growth rate. They just use urbanization as the indicator. That's the indicator of the country. So this is asking you, well, at this level, does it matter for rural prosperity? Now, of course, it's very important that urban is just a threshold, right? There can be rural, which is highly urbanized, as in not highly, but it's not right there, not 75%, but it's somewhere in the 60s and 50s in terms of proportion of people who are doing non-farm. So the question is, then what are the mechanisms at play if it does? What are the kind of jobs? What are the activities? And something that's very important for when you step out of big cities is that is this driven by private or public sector jobs? This is an important thing, and I think this has got relatively less importance. Of course, we like to think about returns to education because we think that the returns are actually productivity. But if public sector drives the returns, then it's not 100% clear that you can interpret the return to an education level as a productivity, because we know that for many people, this may not actually be productivity. It's just that you get a good job and the government gives you kind of artificial high wage. So that's not really productivity. So we'll see the difference. So is there something private going on which is closer to productivity, or is it public, which may or may not be linked to productivity? Okay, so what do we do in this paper? We estimate the impact of a higher share of tertiary educated in the village labor force. So our analysis is going to be at the level of a village. On village prosperity, and we will measure village prosperity in many ways. I'll talk about the data, but this is one measure for my result. I talk about village level mean per capita consumption, but you can look at night lights, you can look at income. I'll show you if you have the time. It doesn't matter what metric I choose. So this is based on 400,000 villages in 27 states of India. It's a large data exercise, so I'll talk about that in a bit. Okay. So the classical problem in this literature of trying to estimate the returns to education, especially at the macro level, is that, of course, tertiary education, especially, and income, as we heard, there's a strong income gradient. So they generally go together. It's not always clear which is the cart and which is the horse. They also share a lot of institutions affect both education as well as income, right? And so, this is a classic problem of how to get a causal impact of education on income. So we take care of that, and I'll tell you why later in terms of controlling for geography, social structure, historical factors that influence tertiary education. In this kind of literature, every variable, which is current variable, is potentially endogenous, right? Because it's driven by processes. And for this paper, which is not going to be, so we identify the impact using exogenous variation generated by location of Catholic missionaries circa 1911 as an instrument. I'll tell you why, but very briefly. So I've already used this instrument in a paper that's published. But the argument here is Catholic missionaries affected tertiary education, but did not affect other institutions that have a direct impact with growth. Of course, there's a paper, 40 pages to show you that. I will not have time for that, but if you want, I can talk briefly about it. Okay. So what do we do? So, of course, this kind of, if you want to use this kind of variation to identify this impact, then the obvious questions are the location of missionaries endogenous? So that requires a history of Catholicism and so on and so forth, which we did, the hard work long time back. And then, of course, the idea of why Catholic missionaries affect higher education, which I think to audiences in India is easier to explain. So we will explore. So once we estimate this impact, we are going to explore the causal and descriptive, mechanisms at play. And I said we're going to look at urban, rural. So you can imagine that as was asked, that you live in rural areas, but actually you work in the nearby urban area, right? So everything happens in the urban area. You're just consuming in the rural area. So that would be about rural jobs and urban jobs. And as I said, we'll look at public and private. So we'll look at various data sets for this mechanism using the National Sample Survey and satellite data. We also explore whether having tertiary educated people in the household impacts agriculture. And we'll talk about, whether that's a channel that affects that gives you prosperity. Oh, okay. So I don't know that I'll be able to reach the end. So what we find, I think, the important thing is, yes, we find a positive impact, a causal impact. It's a 1 percentage point rise in the share of village population with tertiary education, raises per capita consumption by 4%. This is so the base proportion of population 25 and above that has higher education is 5% in this data set. So 1% is actually a large change. And therefore, it causes a large change in per capita consumption. The impacts lead to a larger proportion of village populations in regular jobs, non-farm jobs, less in farming sector. However, you will see in the micro evidence that it raises the probability of regular jobs, but in private jobs, not in public jobs. Okay. These jobs are no more likely to be in urban areas. So it's not that all these private jobs are being generated in urban areas. We'll find that higher educated person in the household, and that point is important, that uh, it's not the case that tertiary educated people in rural areas actually do agriculture. Some of them do. You will see that. I'll show you numbers for that. But it's not necessary that they actually do agriculture. The presence of having higher educated people in the household raises agriculture output per unit of land. Uh, we will find that skilled agriculture is, in fact, the second most reported occupation for tertiary educated living in the village. And we find the presence of tertiary educated member raises the productivity of the household, right? It leads to slightly higher crop diversification. It also leads to more know-how of more modern practices. I will demonstrate all this using results. And in fact, if you believe, nowadays we don't believe surveys for some reason. So if you don't believe surveys, we can see something from satellites too, that these areas are doing more productivity in terms of productivity. Okay, I'm not going to talk about, we're going to show heterogeneities and so on and so forth. So this, okay, let's just move because we will not have time otherwise. So the data is basically based on the census 2011. So we know that there are 6,50,000 villages in India. Now the problem is that this kind of work hasn't happened before, because typically the census records only literacy in villages. Okay, so we can't talk about what's happening in other levels. This was a relevant thing in villages in India for a long time. So that's why we only measured that. But the socioeconomic caste census data, 2011, was the first village level data at kind of pan-India scale to record the number of people with different levels of education, literate, primary, blah, blah, to tertiary. Okay. So there is, of course, no unique code. So this data is public. It has to be scraped, but it's public. Okay. There is no unique code that matches the census to the SECC. So obviously, it's a big exercise in doing string matching using various algorithms. We use particular algorithm in Stata, and we can match 400,000 villages, which is why this analysis is based on 400,000 villages. Okay. This is matched to other kinds of data. People who are working on very similar things, matched the Shrug data, which is nothing but a compilation of a lot of census data. Of course, this data doesn't report the levels of tertiary education. Which one? Yeah. So probably, so we used our own, so we just match what we have to the Shrug. Okay. So after matching, we obtain data on villages for the village level education distribution, population 25 and above. That's going to be our main, that's what we want to look at in terms of impacts. Of course, there is some village demographics we will use for, as controls at some points, village amenities, these come from census. Then there'll be, I'll show you results with consumption. I'll talk about it in a bit. Measure of village average income. This is reported in SECC. It's not great, but it shows the same direction. The variable we'll be using is this imputed village level mean consumption as reported in the Shrug. And of course, as Veena will say, oh, there are a lot of zeros. So we also use visible, VIRS night lights. They're very sensitive night lights data, which are seen to be high proxies of development. And then, there are other things. So the Shrug, the people of Shrug, no, consumption. The income comes from SECC. Just some, they have some ranges. So it's a very, very coarse measure. Yeah. The consumption they measure is that they don't measure their source is also the SECC, but they have the unit level data. SAM has a unit level data for all the households. So they fit a model at a different level and they bring it to the household level with all the assets and they impute consumption and they give you 10,000 realizations, draws from that distribution, but they don't report individual consumption, they report the village level consumption, right? So that's what it is. There are other geographical variables and so on and so forth. They're from various websites. To be honest, they are from my previous paper, so I didn't have to do extra work for that. Okay, so this is not the data we use. This is just to give you a sense of the share of tertiary education in rural India at the sub-district level. It's difficult to show it at the village level because you can't see that. So you can see that there are patterns. We are going to look at intra-state variation. So what we need is essentially that there is enough variation within every state of India, and there is. Like in India, there is variation everywhere. The share of tertiary educated and graduate and above is about 5% in this data set. And those are the other measures we use to look at other proxies for development. Okay. So the estimation equation, it's straightforward. This is the share of tertiary educated for village V in district D in state S. And we want to look at the impact of that on the log of consumption per capita, again, for the same village. Okay. There are some controls, current controls. Again, as I said, in this literature, you are asked not to do that because they're also endogenous. But, we have the village share of SC and ST. It doesn't really matter, but we have it. In a previous avatar of this paper, someone said we should have it, so we have it. There are geographical controls, but these are, of course, time invariant. These are the latitude, longitude of the villages, the squares, rainfall, temperature for 100 years. So those took some extra effort. Rainfall, temperature, distance to nearby towns, area of the village, lengths of rivers, elevation, some idea of proportion of soil that is sandy, which kind of tells you how good it is for agriculture, whether the district is adjoining the coast, and so on and so forth. These are all, things that have independent impacts on per capita consumptions. Then, and this will be motivated in the next slide, we also control for some historical things, share of population that is tribal in 1931, Brahmins in 1931, share of districts that are urban in 1931, princely states, whether they had railway lines, and so on and so forth. The choice of these controls looks curious, but they are there because of the next step, which is when we use the variation in missionaries to predict, in some sense, what impact it had in tertiary education. Of course, missionary location is not exogenous. It depended on things, right? So it depended on a bunch of things, which literature tells us. So these controls will always be there. Okay. So it's state fixed effects. So all comparisons are between villages within a state. They're clustered at sub-district level and so on and so forth. Okay. Whenever one does any jugglery of identification, we are always scared that we are trying to hide some simple descriptive result which goes the opposite direction. I just want to show you that if you just run a simple OLS, there are stars everywhere, and there is at least a 1% effect on tertiary education. Okay, so there is a large effect, even if you just do a simple descriptive by controlling for various things. But as pointed out, these things are correlated and they're confounded, so this will not do. So what we use is the distance of Catholic missionaries in 1911 from each village. So this is different from our previous paper, which only talked about whether a district, and this paper was using 2001 data. It asked if a district had a Catholic missionary or not in 1911. This one is actually a lot more because we are looking at each district and how far it was from the Catholic missionary. This is what's been suggested by Nathan Nunn, which does the same thing for Africa. Okay, so just to show you, this is basically the map. This is the 1911 missionaries, which are now juxtaposed to the 2011 kind of district boundaries. So obviously they're not random. You can see there a lot here on the coast, but so all these things are controlled for. Of course, some of these are railway lines and so on and so forth. Those are controlled for. The essential idea is that, so let me just, because I won't spend too much time on this. The idea is that there are about 4 or 5 things that predict. Catholic missionaries in the 19th century was a very, very disorganized movement. In fact, all the kind of sects came under the Catholic Church only in the 1870s, though the Catholics, various sects of Catholics that landed up in 1600, 1700 and stuff. There's a controversy of whether Syrian Christians are actually Catholics or not. And so this controversy went on. This is in contrast to Protestants, who were actually very well organized. And the 18th century and the 19th century, in fact, had like a very strong movement towards literacy and so on and so forth. It's only in the 1930s, in fact, that the Catholic missionary, the Vatican took note of the fact that the Catholics were being, quote unquote, defeated in India by the Protestants, which then started a kind of a movement towards a more organized kind of work among Catholic missionaries. So the Catholic missionaries are, in places which are doing well, but also in places which are tribal. So there's no one strategy. In fact, there was an Italian Catholic missionary who came and pretended to be a Brahmin to get upper caste Brahmins to come in the fold. But then there were people who went to tribal societies to get, the tribals into the fold. So there, it's not one strategy, right? And so we account for many things, and then the historical kind of narratives say that they essentially went to places where, which basically accommodated them, nothing else. I mean, wherever they found convenient. There was some nobili guy, he came, Italian guy, he stayed somewhere, and someone else sent somewhere. So it's a bit idiosyncratic. Okay, but of course, in the other paper, we show that it doesn't correlate with thousands of other kind of things you think affect growth. So I'm not going to go through that. So when we look at rural education, it seems that this is the distance. The negative is that further you are from Catholic missionaries, worse the tertiary education accomplishment. So obviously, it's the same thing. Catholic missionaries are good for the share of tertiary education. They're all through very significant. And if you use that variation, then you get a 4% impact of 1 percentage point more in share of tertiary education on rural log of per capita consumption per capita. Okay, you can control for various thousands of things. It doesn't change. I'm not going to talk about it, but if you do, so this is one draw. Take 10,000 draws, most of them you'll get the same coefficient. It's not too different. So it doesn't really matter what kind of estimation error is there in the consumption. But that's okay. So so it seems that it has an impact on rural prosperity. So now the question is why? Okay. So, I always find these interesting things to do. What do these guys, so this is National Sample Survey, the employment, unemployment round. So you see the tertiary educated are in regular salaries. But if you actually open it up more in terms of industries, you will see that they're also in agriculture, hunting. They're in education. As my students know, I call it the Great Indian Education Multiplier. Basically, educated people are in education, right? That's what is the biggest profession. If I run this, if I want to check those numbers with some village level regressions, I find exactly that they are less likely to be farmers, casual wage earners. They're more likely to be self-employed and regular wage earners. Now let's unpack this regular job service sector thing. So what is in it? So there are corporate managers. Of course, there is as I said, this Great Indian Education Multiplier. 24% are in teaching. But also among these popular professions of tertiary educated, you see, while this proportion is smaller than for people who are less educated, it's one of the main market-oriented skilled agriculture and fishery workers is actually 24%. It's the third biggest, population occupation for the tertiary educated.
This is just for rural?
Just rural. This paper has nothing on urban. Yeah, about 6%. Give me a second. See, these are all NIC and NCO codes. Yeah, skilled agriculture. So skilled agriculture, I guess, is to do with mechanization that you can. Yeah, that's why 38% of these less educated are also in that, right? So it is to say that you're right, that that it is not like they are the only ones doing it, right? But among them, this is a big profession also. It's not like, so it's to say that all tertiary educated are not just doing these jobs and just not bothering about agriculture. That's all, right? So it's not 100%. It's still 30, 24, 38%. Okay, so then the question is, where are they doing these jobs in, which is the second thing, because you can imagine the following thing, that actually tertiary education causes urbanization in terms of like the towns are becoming like better. And essentially the rural people are just going and working in these towns and these jobs are there and therefore they're educating themselves for these jobs. So if I look at the proportion of people outside village doing these professions, in fact, it's these are all kind of NCO type of names. Actually, they are like, LIC manager, things like that. No, they are not like, these are just NCO codes. So yeah, something. So these are not like, but you can see that, so so this is proportion outside the village. So what it means is that there is a large proportion of these activities that is happening inside the village also. Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. So, so you can also then talk about, so is it the case that people are just commuting for, so that's the other one, because migration rates in India are typically not very high. So it could just be that people are commuting, which has been found in India to be the main thing, that people commute a lot to urban areas. And that's the kind of migration that happens in India. Actually, the proportion of commuting to urban areas is also not very large. People commute, but many of them just commute to other rural areas. Okay, so bottom line, tertiary educator are in two types of professions. There are teaching, skilled agriculture. But I mean, it's not the case that this is just living in a rural area. What I want to drive across is that this is not that the urban is growing, the rural are just, going and working there and coming back and consuming. Because that's not real. I mean, that's just that's a location thing where you build your house. It's not about productivity. So let's just skip that. Yeah. So now to answer the question is how much of this is private sector and how much of it's public, right? So you can see that there is teaching. Yes, there'll be 67%. That's actually public. So, but 33% is private, right? We had this private workshop and the people were talking about how teachers are required to open private schools in villages. Okay? So it's not completely public. This is proportion of private and in rural areas. So you see that these are not, so there are some which are 100%. So these own business, of course, your own business. So it's 100%. If you are a market-oriented, skilled agriculture and fishery workers, it's basically your own thing. So it's private. But everywhere else, so salespersons, that's private. That's not a government job. So there's a sprinkling of public and private in this. It's not the case that these are only clerks working in some government organization. Okay, so if you put this to actual kind of identification, so now what's the problem? The problem is that, if you see people working higher educated and you see people working, for example, in government jobs, you might feel that the government job basically leads to that public sector job. But on the other hand, there are many parts of India where you get public sector jobs anyways. And there's also higher education institutions, so people are getting higher educated, right? So this will give you this artificial correlation between the two without really necessarily being causal in that sense. So if you want to do causal work using the instrument we have, we of course find that, it again, being tertiary educated raises the chance of having a regular wage earner. But the proportion in terms of pure causal work, we find that it actually raises the probability of having a private sector regular wage earner. This is very curious because if you look at just correlation, right, without instrumenting, you find a positive correlation between government jobs and higher education, right? But now you start thinking about where are these government jobs kind of, given? They are not kind of randomly given everywhere. So these are also in places where people are higher educated. So there may be an artificial correlation that you always observe in data. It may not be the case that, these lead to these government sector jobs. And of course, they lead to skilled agriculture and they lead to regular wage earners in the private sector in urban areas. Okay, so that's a positive link. Okay, so bottom line, so, we observe some proportion. Of course, we are not able to see the productivity of these people, which is a weakness. We are able to see that at least it's not completely public. There is a fair degree of private sector work that's going on. Okay. Now, if you want to look at agriculture, we observe that some people are in skilled primary agriculture. So does this change agriculture production? Of course, there is no, like the kind of scale we are talking about, there is no village level data on crop yields. So we are going to rely on micro data on household agriculture profits. Actually, we're not going to look at profits. It's going to be agriculture production per unit of land. And we look at the NSS situation assessment survey of the farmers. So the value of agriculture output per unit of land, and we'll look at other variables also from that. And what we want to look at is we want to look at the impact of having tertiary educated members in the household. And we find that there is a the positive link between tertiary educated members in the household and higher agriculture output per unit. There's higher crop diversification. There's also higher access to technical advice. So I don't know, Veena, you'll have to find out more. This is the National Sample Survey situation assessment telling us this is so. Oh, no. This is among farmers. This is among farmers. So it's no, definitely. So I also think that the young, these educated people also don't love living in the rural areas for that matter, right? But they are living there, right? So they are living there. So the question is, it's not a small number. Among the young, 15% of them are actually staying in those places, right? Yeah. Well, it's helping rural prosperity, you can see, right? And in fact, I'll tell you a story. So some farmers, when I used to do the survey, used to tell me that when we said, in fact, Palanpur, again, Himanshu would have been here, that wo bachcha bahar chala jata hai, they go out to get higher education, and then they come once in a while in a year and give us advice. And who are they to give us advice? We are farmers. We are doing these guys go out and learn some hanky-panky stuff and come and advise us. So I have started thinking that maybe this effect is largely because if you're staying in the household, the dynamics of how you can communicate with a father who's just in agriculture, less educated than you, is going to be very different than these migrants who then go to urban areas and then keep coming back and then giving you this sporadic advice, right? Oh, you should be doing this. Oh, you don't know this, things like that. So I think that why we find this kind of result is in fact the reason why, that because they're staying there, they are living there with their parents. Or they're living there. I don't know with their parents or not, but they're living there. Yeah, because this is for everyone, right? So, okay. So, few things we find that this effect is largest when when the soil quality is better. So this is above sandy. This is above median sandy means that the soil quality is really bad. So this requires some complementarity. If you're living in an arid zone, yeah, having a tertiary educated, whatever member in the families cannot really do much. If you look at rainfall, we get very similar results. These are areas which have above median rainfall in that year as compared to the 100-year average, or I think 10 years actually, not 1 year. So these are areas which have generally got good rainfall. So it's not that you just get a tertiary educated person and they'll just change the world, right? So you require some complementary things, natural resources, which are there. So now if you don't believe the situation assessment survey, go up, start looking from the space. So net primary product is like in the satellite models, which has larger grids than just villages. So yeah, you've been mentioned so many times. Now you're going to miss everything. But anyway, we find in fact that it has similar to the agriculture output per unit of land. We find that this is higher net primary productivity. So this is confirmed through a satellite. Okay, so results stay the same. If you use income, that course income, you use night lights, you use anything. So one of the worries is the zeros. So, typically we take a log and some addition to take care of it, but you can also take other kinds of transformations, sign transformations, which are better to deal with this kind of data. So this is important in this literature because when you have a lot of zeros, you can get very strange answers. You change something and everything changes, right? So this doesn't change once you use that also. You drop one state at a time. So of course, every state has a different story, but these results are not driven by any one state, okay? And for those who want to quibble about clustering, this is clustered at all kinds of levels, results go through. So I'm not going to present. There are some things you might believe. You might believe that essentially what happens is tertiary educated people stay in villages which actually have great infrastructure, right? And it's the infrastructure that causes the growth and not the tertiary education. So take your favorite pick of all village level public goods that are there. In fact, we take all of them, but you can take any pick. So the idea is that if this is what is causing the spurious correlation, then if you control for this, your effect should disappear, right? And you can see, you can control one at a time, you can control together. Yeah, the coefficient of tertiary education stays kind of the same at some points, it also goes up. Okay. Since this is the inequality conference, I wanted to say something about inequality too. It's not in the paper. I'll tell you why. It's also a very interesting story about how academia is progressing now. So as I said, what do we show so far? We show that the average per capita expenditure, the average growth, average levels increase. But if you take any inequality index, like the tail, we find that it's also inequality enhancing, right? These villages report a higher level of inequality. This is, of course, using a very coarse income distribution that is given in the SECC. So you should take it. But if anything, we should always guard ourselves to all the bad things that can happen. This coarse distribution based on the various income ranges that are reported in the SECC data point out that while on an average the village does better, the village also starts getting more unequal. Okay. Now the question is, so I go back. Yeah, the tail index. Yeah, but you can do it with Gini also and stuff. It's not intra-village. Exactly, because the SECC will give you like the distribution of income in a very coarse way for each village, right? And it's using that. So it's coarse, so that's why I don't necessarily always report it in the paper, but because it's an inequality conference, I think we should also face that there is probably some truth in this thing also, right? So it's been a puzzle that if you leave out the uber rich, economic inequality as measured by consumption is not very high in India. I think we have had many conferences, Himanshu and I have organized inequality things, thinking about this issue. But these results imply that education unfolds two processes, right? So there is this higher education growth fosters some sort of convergence between the rural and urban. Of course, this is a guess. My paper is not about that, but the fact that rural growth, rural levels start rising means that this is going to kind of reduce inequality between the villages and between the urban towns and villages, right? But at the same time, within rural inequalities will start to rise. Okay. Now, why it's a tail is, of course, if you add the two to get the overall inequality, you will not get any answer. And this is the point that I think Pete raised for the first time, that in fact, what may be happening is people in the villages may be crying, loud, saying, what is happening? It's, we are seeing unequal people. These people have, higher education and many of the things you talk about, the difference between the rich and the poor. But the towns and the villages, they are at the same time coming probably more and more close to each other. So when you're looking at a kind of a national kind of figure of inequality, it seems like very placid, right? But there are interesting things that may be happening at the same time. So it's possible that these forces net out, which is why overall inequality doesn't change. It doesn't mean inequality is unimportant. It means that exactly what Professor Tilak was talking about, to think about these issues of access to people from poorer households in these villages may be important. Okay, I'm done. Last slide. So tertiary education, to conclude, is growing in India, even in rural places. They contribute to village prosperity. Some of it is generated in rural areas. Private has a large component. There's a rising agriculture productivity, on which Bina will tell us in 2 years exactly why this is happening. What has a big impact is structural transformation of this kind. So if you go back to these bigger models of structural transformation, right? There is a very important role in that of agglomeration, which is driven by migration and urbanization. This caricature model of people, in fact, it's not even 50s now, even recent papers in JPE and stuff, they all model things like this. As soon as you get educated, there are economies of scale, all the higher educated people move to towns, they become managers, they become entrepreneurs, and then economic growth happens because of that. This is saying that this is not true. At least in India, we seem to be getting a different kind of structural transformation. We are getting a structural transformation which is driven by, for some, which may be parts of the problem. Some of the problems we have, urban areas don't have enough jobs for educated. Yeah, these kind of problems. So in fact, but these are the kind of problems that seem to be kind of making people stay back in villages. Of course, they could be staying back because of their own interests also. I'm not assuming that. For whatever reason, they're staying back in these villages. And this is leading to some increase in rural prosperity. So it seems that a transformation is happening as we debate about various things. A silent transformation is happening anyways because of higher education. Thank you.